what if everything we thought we knew about, the end of the world wasn't really about the future end of the world?
Right. What if it was actually about a huge pivotal moment in history that, well, that already happened?
Exactly. We're about to take a deep dive into a really fascinating book, The Last Days According to Jesus. And it really challenges our whole understanding of biblical prophecy.
Yeah, it does. Our journey today, it's going to explore New Testament eschatology. That's the fancy term for the study of last things.
We'll be looking closely at Jesus's own predictions, the writings of Paul and John too.
And also the historical record, specifically about a catastrophic event in the first century, the destruction of Jerusalem.
So our mission today is to unpack these ancient prophecies, look at the different ways people interpret them,
And try to figure out what these texts might have meant to the people who first heard them.
and maybe more importantly, what that means for you listening right now.
We're definitely going to bump into some challenging questions, uncover some surprising facts, hopefully without getting totally bogged down.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Our deep dive kicks off on the Mount of Olives. Jesus has just made this really startling declaration about the Jerusalem temple, the big, magnificent one.
He basically looks at it and says, "Not one stone shall be left upon another." You can find that in Matthew 24, verse 2.
Now, you can imagine this gets his disciples, Peter, James, John, and Andrew, pretty worked up.
Understandably. So they pull him aside privately and ask him straight up, "Tell us, when will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age?"
So those three questions right there. When does the temple fall? What's the sign of his coming, his parousia? And what about the end of the age?
Yeah, those questions really set the whole stage. And a key thing to grasp here is how important Jesus' own time frame references become, especially for these interpretations suggesting it all happened back then.
Right, and central to that is probably his most famous, and let's be honest, maybe most perplexing statement on timing.
Which one's that?
Assuredly, I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all these things take place. It's in Mark 13 and Matthew 24.
Ah, yes. That hurts. It's absolutely foundational for the viewpoint known as preterism.
Explain that a bit. What does preterism argue based on that verse?
Well, proponents, like J. Stuart Russell back in the day, argued that this generation wasn't some vague future thing. It meant the specific generation alive right then.
So a specific time frame.
Exactly, roughly 40 years, which lines up pretty neatly, with Jesus' ministry around AD 30-33 and the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70.
Okay, so they see a direct link.
A direct link. And the really compelling, maybe challenging part of this view is that it assumes all these things Jesus mentioned, including his parousia, his coming,
Yeah.
were fulfilled by AD 70.
Wow. Okay, that really flips the script on traditional interpretations, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
Because think about it. If Jesus' coming didn't happen by AD 70, then critics like Bertrand Russell famously charged that Jesus was simply wrong.
And the Bible along with him.
Right. Preterism offers a completely different lens to view those words. It says, maybe he wasn't wrong. Maybe we just misunderstood the timing and the nature of the coming.
So what else did Jesus say would happen? He outlined some signs, right?
He did. He talked about a series of events that would precede the end, calling them the beginning of sorrows.
Like what?
Things like false Christs popping up, wars and rumors of wars, nation against nation, kingdom against kingdom, then famines, pestilences, earthquakes, and also persecution of his followers.
Okay, standard end time stuff for many people.
Well, yes, but what's compelling for preterists is how they meticulously connect these predictions to actual recorded historical events between Christ's resurrection and AD 70.
So not just vague possibilities, but actual history.
Exactly. The source points to specific things like violent clashes between Jews and Greeks in places like Alexandria and Syria. There were severe famines under Emperor Claudius, that's AD 41 to 54.
Right.
Even earthquakes during the reigns of Caligula and Claudius. These things aren't just generalities. They seem to line up quite precisely with the historical record of that period.
Okay, that's pretty specific. What about the abomination of desolation? That sounds ominous.
It does. Jesus warns about it standing in the holy place, Matthew 24.15. For preterists, this is another critical link.
How so?
They see it fulfilled when the Roman legions, carrying their standards which had images of the emperor and eagles, considered idolatrous by Jews, entered the temple area.
Ah, violating the holy space.
Precisely. Josephus, the historian we'll talk more about, documented how fiercely Jews resisted any Roman standards, even entering Jerusalem, let alone the temple. So the Romans doing that during the siege. A clear desecration. an abomination.
Okay, okay. But then you get to the really cosmic stuff Jesus mentions, right? The sun darkening, moon not giving light, stars falling.
Yeah, and that's where many people immediately think, okay, that hasn't happened yet. That must be the literal end of the physical universe.
That's the common interpretation for sure.
But a key insight from the preterist perspective is that this kind of graphic imagery might actually be metaphorical.
Metaphorical? How?
It's actually very consistent with Old Testament prophetic language. Prophets used cosmic-level descriptions, sun darkening, stars falling to describe huge, earth-shattering political events, like the fall of Babylon or Egypt.
So it's poetic language for divine judgment on a nation or empire, not necessarily the literal end of the cosmos.
Exactly. Think of it as like high drama poetry to convey the immense significance of God's judgment falling on a particular nation or system. It signals the end of an order, not necessarily the end of everything.
That's a very different way of reading it. Even someone like John Calvin apparently noted that Luke's version mentions signs in the heavens, not necessarily literal falling stars.
Right, emphasizing the symbolic potential. And this feeling of things happening soon is reinforced by another bit, the parable of the fig tree.
Remind us of that one.
Jesus says basically when you see the leaves sprouting, you know summer is near. Similarly, when you see all these things happening, the signs he just listed, you should know that it is near the very doors.
So more imminence.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Especially concerning Jerusalem's destruction. For preterists, this parable isn't about, say, modern Israel being founded. It's a direct, urgent warning to that first-century audience about the judgment coming upon their city and temple.
Okay, so if Jesus was talking about things that were near at the very doors, that leads us to decode what he actually meant by the end of the age or the last days, because we often hear that translated as the end of the world.
Yeah, and this isn't just like a minor translation issue. For preterists, it's absolutely fundamental.
Why is it so critical?
The Greek word Jesus likely uses aigen, and aigen doesn't primarily mean the physical planet, the cosmos. It refers to a period of time, an era, an epoch, or a dispensation.
Ah, so age, not world.
Precisely. So if Jesus was actually talking about the end of the Jewish age, the end of that specific covenantal era centered around the temple,
And not the literal end of the planet Earth.
then it completely reframes the prophecy. It means the fulfillment could have happened in AD 70 with the destruction of the temple and the end of that specific Ein.
Wow. That implies we might have been looking for the fulfillment in the wrong place and maybe the wrong time for centuries.
That's the core of the preterist argument on this point. You see it even in translations like the King James Version of Matthew 13. It says, the harvest is the end of the world. But the Greek Ein really implies the end of the age. That distinction changes everything.
Okay. And this connects to the Old Testament idea of the day of the Lord, right?
It does. That concept started as a day of salvation for Israel. But over time, especially in the prophets, it increasingly came to signify a day of fierce divine judgment.
So how do preterists link that to AD 70?
They argue that prophecies like Malachi's great and dreadful day of the Lord, which the New Testament links to John the Baptist heralding Jesus, ultimately pointed towards the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 as the climactic day of the Lord judgment for that generation of the Jewish nation.
Interesting. Didn't Peter mention something similar on the day of Pentecost?
He did. In Acts, Peter quotes the prophet Joel, talking about wonders, blood, fire, smoke, the sun turning dark, the moon to blood, all before the great and notable day of the Lord. And Peter says, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. He saw a connection even then.
And the source also mentions Jesus' own parables towards the end of his ministry.
Right, like the parable of the pounds in Luke 19. They often have this heavy emphasis on coming judgment, which preterists naturally see as foreshadowing Jerusalem's fate.
There's also that phrase in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, something about the Gentiles.
Yes, Luke 21. It mentions Jerusalem being trampled by Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled.
How does that fit in?
Well, this idea of distinct Jewish and Gentile epochs or times really supports the preterist notion that the end of the age specifically referred to the end of the Jewish age, making way for the times of the Gentiles.
Okay, so it reinforces the idea of a transition between eras, not the end of all time.
Exactly. It's about a shift in God's primary focus in redemptive history, as they see it.
And this sense of urgency of the last days being then seems widespread in the New Testament.
Oh, absolutely. The book hammers this home. You see phrases like shortly, quickly, at hand, the time is near, repeated constantly.
Where specifically?
Revelation is full of it. Chapter 1, verse 1 and chapter 22, verse 6. Things which must shortly take place. Chapter 1, verse 3, The time is near. Jesus says repeatedly in chapter 22, I am coming quickly.
And elsewhere, too.
Yeah, 1 John 2.18 talks about it being the last hour, and many antichrists have come. Matthew 10.23 has Jesus telling the disciples they won't finish going through the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. Romans 13 says salvation is nearer to us now than when we first believed. The night is far gone, the day is at hand.
So preterists look at all these verses together
And argue pretty forcefully that this language demands a near-time fulfillment. These weren't vague promises for thousands of years later. They were urgent messages for the people reading them then in the first century.
which obviously raises a huge question for us today.
The big one. How do we square that incredibly imminent language with the fact that, well, here we are 2,000 years later, critics jump all over that apparent delay?
Right. But for preterists, the answer isn't delay, it's
That the events did happen, close to when the words were written, just maybe not in the way later generations expected. They insist we have to take that imminent language seriously in its plain sense.
okay, to really get our heads around this, we need to look at the history. What actually happened in AD 70?
Yeah, the historical context is absolutely vital. Remember, Israel was under Roman occupation. It started with Pompey's conquest back in 63 BC.
And then a whole line of emperors.
Augustus, Tiberius, the notorious Caligula, Claudius, and then, critically for this period, Nero. Roman rule was the backdrop for everything.
And this is where Flavius Josephus becomes so important. Who was he again?
Josephus was a Jewish historian, actually born around AD 37 or 38, so he lived through this period. And crucially, he was an eyewitness to the Jewish war against Rome and the eventual destruction of Jerusalem.
An eyewitness account. Wow. Is it reliable?
Well, like any historical source, it has its biases. Josephus was captured by the Romans, switched sides in a way, and wrote partly to justify himself and explain Jewish history to a Roman audience. So you read him critically.
But still.
But still, his work, The Jewish War, provides an incredibly detailed first-hand account that we just don't have anywhere else for these events.
What does he describe?
He describes Rome's methodical campaign. He was actually a Jewish general himself at the siege of Jotapata, fighting against Vespasian, who later became emperor.
Fought against the future emperor.
Yep. And then, eventually, the focus shifted to the ultimate prize, the siege of Jerusalem itself, led by Vespasian's son, Titus.
And the siege. Josephus describes horrors.
Unspeakable horrors. He details the conditions inside the besieged city, particularly the extreme famine. It got so bad he records truly desperate acts, like a mother roasting and eating her own child. Just horrific.
God, that's grim.
It is. And the final toll was staggering. Josephus claims 1.1 million people were killed during the siege and its aftermath, and another 97,000 were taken captive, sold into slavery, or condemned to the mines or arenas.
So for preterists, this isn't just ancient history.
No, for preterists, this is the fulfillment. This is the great tribulation Jesus predicted, the judgment falling with shocking reality. It fundamentally changes how you read prophecies that people often project way into our future.
Josephus didn't just record the fighting and suffering, did he? He mentioned strange signs, too.
He did. He talks about these bizarre and strange sightings that happened before the final destruction.
Like what kind of sightings?
Things like a star that looked like a sword hanging over the city, a comet that was visible for a whole year, we think now, that was Halley's Comet, which appeared in AD 66.
Halley's Comet. Wow.
Yeah. Also, a really bright light shining around the temple altar at night, a cow giving birth to a lamb in the temple court.
Weird.
And even stranger, he reports a vision of chariots and soldiers running around among the clouds and surrounding cities.
Chariots in the clouds. It sounds like something out of, well, prophecy.
It really does.
Hmm.
And perhaps most chillingly, he recorded that priests inside the temple heard a great commotion and a voice, or multiple voices, saying, "Let us remove hence. Let us leave this place."
Good grief. That echoes Ezekiel, doesn't it? God's glory leaving the temple before the Babylonians destroyed it.
Exactly the parallel many draw. It suggests divine abandonment before the final judgment. And he wasn't just Josephus seeing weird stuff.
Oh.
The respected Roman historian Tacitus also wrote about prodigies in the sky and on the earth around this same time, coinciding with turmoil in Rome itself.
So multiple sources reporting strange phenomena.
Which, for preterists, adds weight to the idea that something incredibly significant, divinely ordained, was happening. They see Josephus's detailed account as powerful evidence for what they call the radical fulfillment of Jesus's Olivet Discourse.
viewing the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 as the ultimate judgment coming, the parousia of Christ against that generation.
That's the core of their interpretation of that event.
Okay, this naturally leads us straight into the book of Revelation, because how you interpret that book seems heavily tied to when you think it was written.
Absolutely. The dating is critical. If Revelation was written after AD 70, which is the traditional view held by many,
Then its prophecies about judgment, Babylon falling, etc., probably refer to future events, maybe the fall of Rome later, or events still to come.
right. But if it was written before AD 70, the early date view, championed by preterists like Kenneth Gentry Jr.,
Then,
then its dramatic prophecies could very well be describing the events surrounding Jerusalem's fall, using apocalyptic symbolism. The when and the why of Revelation are really tied together.
and the book itself, does it give clues about timing? Preterists point to imminent language there, too.
Oh, definitely. Revelation is saturated with it. We mentioned it before, but it bears repeating. Things which must shortly take place, right at the beginning and end. The time is near. I am coming quickly. Over and over.
Plus phrases like about to take place.
Exactly. Preterist scholars emphasize this triad of terms on attaché, shortly quickly, engis, near at hand, and mello, about to, arguing they strongly indicate fulfillment was expected by the original first-century readers.
You just can't easily stretch shortly or near to mean thousands of years, can you?
It's linguistically difficult, they argue. Lexicographers generally agree these terms signify immediacy. Applying them to events millennia later requires, well, some interpretive gymnastics.
What about evidence from outside the Bible, early church writers?
That's where it gets a bit murky, honestly. The external evidence is debated. The main piece, used for a late date, around AD 95, comes from Irenaeus, who wrote that the vision was seen not long ago, but almost in our own generation, towards the end of Domitian's reign.
Sounds pretty clear for a late date under Emperor Domitian.
It does sound clear, but some scholars question it. They argue Irenaeus might have meant that John the Apostle was seen or lived towards the end of Domitian's reign, not necessarily that the vision itself occurred then. The Greek is apparently a bit ambiguous.
Okay. Any evidence pointing earlier?
Well, Clement of Alexandria mentions John returning from exile on the island of Patmos after the death of the tyrant. Many assume the tyrant was Domitian, but others argue the tyrant was a very common way to refer to Nero. And if John was exiled under Domitian, he'd have been extremely old, maybe in his 90s. Some anecdotes Clement shares about John's activities after returning seem more plausible if he were younger, returning after Nero's death in AD 68.
So the external evidence isn't completely conclusive either way.
The source argues it's ambiguous, and when you look closely, the arguments for a Neronic date, pre-AD 70, might actually be stronger, or at least just as plausible, as the traditional Domitianic date.
Okay, what about clues inside Revelation itself? You mentioned the sixth king.
Ah, yes, Revelation 17.10. This is a fascinating historical puzzle. It talks about the beast having 7 heads, representing 7 mountains. Almost everyone agrees that means Rome, and also 7 kings.
And the timing clue.
It says 5 have fallen, 1 is, and the other has not yet come. So the book claims to be written during the reign of the 6th king.
Who would that be?
Depends where you start counting Roman emperors, which was debated even then. But if you start with Julius Caesar as number 1, which was common,
Then Augustus is 2, Tiberius 3, Caligula 4, Claudius 5.
and Nero is number 6, the one who is.
Which would place the writing of Revelation squarely during Nero's reign, before AD 70.
Precisely. It's a strong internal marker pointing to the early date, according to preterists.
And what about the temple in Jerusalem? Does Revelation mention it?
It does, quite significantly. Revelation 11 talks about measuring the temple, the altar, and the worshipers. It depicts the temple complex as still standing and functioning.
That seems important.
Hugely important. The source calls it a deafening silence if the book were written after AD 70. Why describe measuring a temple that was already a pile of rubble?
Good point.
So its presence as an active standing structure provides really compelling internal evidence for that pre-AD 70 date.
So putting it all together, preterists see Revelation not as a blueprint for the distant future, but as
essentially an extended, highly symbolic version of Jesus' Olivet Discourse, describing his imminent coming in judgment against first-century Jerusalem, often symbolized as Babylon, or the city where their Lord was crucified.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. What about the Antichrist? That's a figure everyone associates with the end times.
Right, the ultimate bad guy. Interestingly, the term Antichrist itself is only used explicitly by the Apostle John in his letters, not in Revelation or by Paul.
Oh, really? Just John. What does he say?
John actually says two key things. First, that many antichrists have already come, which tells us it's not just one future figure. And second, he speaks of the spirit of the Antichrist, which he says is now already in the world.
So it was a present reality for John, not just future.
Seems so. Which raises the question, was John talking about one specific person to come, or more about a system of belief, like the early Gnosticism he was combating, or maybe a pervasive spirit of opposition to Christ?
Do scholars connect John's Antichrist to other figures, like Paul's Man of Lawlessness?
Many do. Paul, in 2 Thessalonians 2, talks about a man of lawlessness, or man of sin, who opposes God and even takes his seat in the temple of God, proclaiming himself to be God.
That sounds like a specific person, and the temple reference again.
It does sound personal. Though it's worth noting, some interpreters, like Calvin again, thought Paul's temple might refer metaphorically to the church, not the physical building in Jerusalem, but the description is very much like an individual dictator.
Which connects to the beast in Revelation, right?
Yeah.
Chapter 13.
Exactly. Revelation 13 describes this terrifying beast rising from the sea, representing tyrannical political power, empowered by the dragon, Satan. And this beast has a number.
The famous 666, the number of a man.
The ultimate riddle. And this is where the preterist interpretation gets really specific and, frankly, quite compelling for many.
They have a candidate for the beast for 666.
They have a leading candidate, Emperor Nero.
Nero again. How does he fit 666?
Through an ancient practice called isopsaphia, or gematria, where letters in a name have numerical values. If you take Nero's official title, Neron Caesar, and spell it in Hebrew letters, N-O-R-N-Q-S-R, the letters add up precisely to 6666.
Whoa, serious.
Seriously. And what's more, there's a known textual variant in some early manuscripts of Revelation where the number is 616, not 666. If you spell Neron Caesar using the Latin spelling, omitting the N at the end, Nero QSR, as it sometimes appeared, and transliterate that into Hebrew, it adds up to 616.
That's uncanny. Two different spellings of Nero's name matching the two different numbers found in manuscripts.
It's pretty remarkable. Combine that numerical link with Nero's documented historical character, his tyranny, his persecution of Christians after the fire of Rome, his demands for divine honors, essentially emperor worship.
Which fits Paul's Man of Lawlessness proclaiming himself God.
Exactly. It paints a very strong picture of Nero as the primary first-century fulfillment of the beast figure for those original readers.
Okay, this brings us to a really crucial distinction, a split within preterism itself. It's not all one view, is it?
Not at all. There's a major fork in the road. You have basically two main schools, full preterism and partial preterism.
Let's start with full preterism. What's their core belief?
Full preterism, sometimes called radical or consistent preterism, championed by folks like J. Stuart Russell, who we mentioned, and more recently Max R. King, argues that all New Testament prophecies about the last days were fulfilled, primarily in or around AD 70.
All of them, including
the second coming or parousia of Christ, the resurrection of the dead, the rapture, the final judgment, everything.
But wait, how can the resurrection and final judgment have already happened?
They interpret these events spiritually, not physically or globally. For them, the resurrection in AD 70 was a transition from the old covenant age of death under the law to the new covenant age of life in Christ. It was about the body of Christ, the church, fully coming into its own, not individual bodies coming out of graves.
A spiritual transformation, not a physical one.
Correct. The coming of Christ was his coming in judgment against Jerusalem and in vindication of his church. The judgment was executed upon that generation.
Okay, that's radical, as the name suggests. What about partial preterism, then?
Partial preterism, also called moderate or orthodox preterism, represented by scholars like Kenneth Gentry Jr., agrees with full preterism on much of the interpretation of the Olivet Discourse in Revelation.
They agree AD 70 was hugely significant.
Yes, they agree that AD 70 was a major coming of Christ in judgment, fulfilling many of those specific prophecies about Jerusalem and the end of the Jewish age.
But the partial means they don't think everything was fulfilled.
Exactly. Partial preterists maintain that certain key events are still future. Specifically, the final, physical, visible second coming of Christ, parousia, the general bodily resurrection of all the dead, both believers and unbelievers, and the ultimate final judgment at the end of world history.
So they see AD 70 as a major prophetic fulfillment, a type maybe, but not the final fulfillment of all eschatology.
That's a good way to put it. AD 70 closed the Jewish age, but not world history itself.
This difference seems to really hinge on the nature of the resurrection, doesn't it? Spiritual versus physical.
It's absolutely critical. Partial preterists strongly emphasize the historic Christian creeds, like the Apostles' Creed, which explicitly affirm the resurrection of the body, carnis resurrectionem.
They point to Jesus' own resurrection.
Yes, they argue Jesus' resurrection was physical, tangible. He had a body, could be touched, eat food, left an empty tomb. They believe our future resurrection will be like his.
And they feel full preterism's spiritual resurrection doesn't align with that.
They argue it raises serious questions about consistency. If Christ's resurrection was physical, why would the general resurrection be merely spiritual? Full preterists like Russell counter that a spiritual body might be different, perhaps not seen or touched in the same way.
But that raises questions about whether it's a body at all, in the way we normally think of it.
That's the debate. Max King proposed a complex three-stage resurrection process culminating in a spiritual rising into the new eon in AD 70. But it's definitely a departure from the traditional understanding of physical bodily resurrection.
Okay, what about the rapture? Paul's description in 1 Thessalonians 4, caught up in the clouds, trumpets, shouts.
Another key difference. Full preterists tend to see that language as symbolic, apocalyptic imagery, part of the spiritual transition and gathering of the church in AD 70.
Not a literal physical event.
Right, whereas partial preterists, along with most other views like futurism, generally see the rapture described there as a future, literal, visible event accompanying Christ's final return.
Yeah.
They argue the language points to a physical snatching away.
It sounds like these two views within preterism lead to very different overall pictures of history and the future.
They really do. And the source also briefly touched on how these views relate to the main millennial positions, premillennialism, amillennialism, postmillennialism.
How does that fit?
Well, postmillennialism, which tends to be optimistic about the gospel's progress in history before Christ returns, often aligns well with partial preterism. Seeing AD 70 as clearing the way for the Gentile age fits that optimism. Full preterism is a bit harder to categorize within those traditional frameworks because it sees the entire process, including the millennium, if interpreted that way, as completed in the first century.
So it highlights fundamental differences in how Christians view the trajectory of history and the nature of God's kingdom. Is it primarily past, present, or future? Optimistic or pessimistic about the current age?
Precisely. These aren't just minor interpretive squabbles. They shape your whole understanding of God's plan.
Wow. Okay, we have covered a lot of ground. We've taken this deep dive into a really complex area of biblical prophecy. We looked at how the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70 acts as this crucial pivot point for understanding so many last days prophecies.
Yeah, from Jesus' own words in the Olivet Discourse right through to the symbolism in the book of Revelation, we've really explored the strong arguments for pre-irritation, especially how it highlights those time frame references and the historical fulfillments back then.
And seen how it seriously challenges a lot of the traditional, maybe more future-focused interpretations that many of us grew up with or assume.
Definitely. And we've grappled with some huge questions. The identity of the Antichrist, was it Nero? The nature of the resurrection, is it physical or spiritual? What did end of the age truly mean?
And we saw the crucial split between full preterists, who see basically all of it as fulfilled in the past,
and partial preterists who agree AD 70 was massive, but believe the ultimate second coming, resurrection, and judgment are still ahead of us at the end of world history.
So thinking about all this, for you listening right now, what's the takeaway?
Well, here's maybe a final thought to chew on. If it's true that many of these biblical prophecies, especially those with really explicit time frames like this generation or shortly or near, if they did have an imminent first century fulfillment centered on AD 70, what does that tell us about how we should read other prophecies, ones that don't have such specific timing attached?
Does it change how we look for fulfillments today?
Maybe. And maybe, just maybe, could understanding this historical fulfillment actually reshape our focus? Perhaps shifting it away from endlessly trying to decode today's headlines to predict a distant future.
And more towards engaging with the present reality of God's kingdom right here, right now, in our own age. What does it mean to live faithfully now, given what happened then?
That seems like a pretty profound question to end on.